Okay, so let's get started. Remember the last time we had talked about the Articles of Confederation and the weaknesses of the Articles, that it really gave more power to the state, and you really had a shadow of a federal government, and that was causing all sorts of problems in terms of trade and boundaries, and even France was confused. I know, shocking. They sent 13 ambassadors. They didn't know if this was one country or 13. Most people thought of their individual state as their country. And there were a group of founders like Madison and Hamilton, a younger generation, who said, this is just not working. We need something more efficient, a stronger central government. Now, we left off with the so-called Annapolis Convention, which was organized by Hamilton and Madison and others who began calling themselves Federalists, as an idea of getting the states together ostensibly to talk about matters of business and trade. That's what they said, but really they wanted to do something about the Articles. But only 5 of 13 states showed up, not a very good turnout. And so they did get a call. They went to the Confederation Congress and said, would you make a call? And they did. And so they're going to meet the following year in 1787 in Philadelphia, with the express purpose of what they say is to revise the Articles. That's it, just to revise them. Now, that's not what Madison has in mind. Madison has in mind that he wants to scrap the Articles completely. He sees them as a failure. But he knows that he can't go out and say that, because then maybe states don't show up. So this time, they get a little bit better turnout of the states. This time, they get 12 of 13. Now, the only state that doesn't show up is Rhode Island. They don't send delegates. Some of the New York delegates go home early, so they're, Hamilton's not be able to vote on this. But 12 of 13 isn't bad. But it would also suggest that you're going to have to get rid of the Articles, because if you wanted to change the Articles, you had to have 13 of 13. Well, if you've got a state that's not there, that's not going to happen. So you get 12 of 13, and roughly, and I say roughly because books will say differently from time to time, roughly around 74 to 76 delegates are appointed. But of those 76 or 75 or wherever, only 55 ever show up. And the reason that a lot of people don't show up is because work, family, death, you name it, they don't make it. And then of the 55, the average daily attendance at the convention is only going to be 30. So half the people show up of the people that actually attended the convention. And then when we get to the end of the convention, of that 55, only 39 signed their name to the document. 39. So this is not just the average person attending this convention. They tend to be the elites of society, the business elites, the economic elites, the agricultural elites. In fact, it led to a 1890s historian named Charles Beard suggesting that these guys, they weren't really interested in democracy or a republic. What they were interested in was protecting their own pocketbook. Now, most historians don't agree with Charles Beard's description of them today, but Beard made that assumption at the time. This tends to be a younger group of individuals. The average age is about 42. Now, I know you're thinking, well, Brian, wasn't the life expectancy around 36 at the time? True. But as I said before, life expectancy means all those people were dying before they were 21. Yellow fever, typhus, you name it, smallpox, scarlet fever would come through, the measles, and take out a lot of your children. But if you could make it to 21, then you probably lived into your 60s or so. That wasn't uncommon, but getting to there was the hard part. So 42 was a young age, ostensibly for that time period. Now, the older person, obviously, and you can see him right back here, is Franklin. He's 81. He's one of the only people to sign the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution. And the other person, the youngest, was a guy named Dayton, out of New Jersey. He was 26. So sort of an age gap, but average age about 42. So it's important to note who's here at this convention. Well, as you can see behind me, sorry, the other side, George Washington. They had to get Washington. Washington had been up at Mount Rushmore, not Mount Rushmore, he is on Mount Rushmore, Mount Vernon. And he'd been growing increasingly concerned about what he saw going on in the country. Now, Washington is an interesting character because he had won a victory. He had won the revolution, right? And in 1783, he did something that was fairly unheard of at the time, was that instead of taking that and saying, I'm going to use this to obtain power, he relinquishes power. Because historically in Europe, after you won great military victories, you expected political power. But Washington in 1783 had said, you know what, my family dies young. Here's my sword. I resign my commission. Thank you very much. I'm going to Mount Vernon. I'll probably die because my family dies young. Well, he's still alive. And so they call him back. Now, he doesn't say much here. He just presides over the meeting. Washington was fairly aristocratic in that regard. You weren't supposed to speak to him unless he spoke to you. Your flesh wasn't supposed to touch his flesh, that sort of thing. And he certainly ran a stern meeting. Now, some important people besides Washington there. One of them is going to be James Madison. Now, Madison, let's see if I can move. He's right there in that sort of orangey coat. Madison is really known as the father of the Constitution because it's mainly his ideas. Now, Madison is about 5'2", fairly short man. He dressed in black a lot because his fiancée had recently dumped him, and he was sort of sad about that. And he's not a real strong, commanding voice. You wouldn't see James Earl Jones or anybody like that being able to play James Madison, because Madison is a small, squeaky voice. And often in the meetings, they're always yelling at him, speak up, we can't hear you. And it's not a big room if you've been to Philadelphia and seen the room. It's the same room where they did the Declaration of Independence. But it's mainly his ideas. He brings a lot of books, and people respect him for that. Now, the other person is going to be Alexander Hamilton that we want to mention. Hamilton, of course, he's the visionary of all of this. Hamilton was not born in the United States, born in the West Indies. And he came over early and was the idea of the ultimate immigrant, right? He's self-made. He volunteers to fight in the war. He moves up to become one of Washington's most trusted aides. And he looked around and he said, why are you guys arguing so much? If you could put aside your differences and don't think of being a New England or middle or Southern colony person, but think of yourself as a country, you've got so much going on. You've got this ocean that separates you from Europe that keeps you out of those continental affairs. You've got all these natural resources. If we could just get our act together and get around these piddling states and have a stronger central government, we could do something. Well, Hamilton is a visionary, but he's not liked by a lot of people. I know you can watch the musical Hamilton and think, well, he seems like a fairly nice guy, but Hamilton was one of the smartest people in the room, clearly. And the thing is with Hamilton, he let you know that he was the smartest person in the room. He was very arrogant, very vain. And so not well liked. And for many of them, they considered Hamilton, a B-A-S-T-A-R-D. I don't guess. So I had to spell it out for you because his parents never married the West Indies. And so Hamilton makes a lot of political enemies very quickly. I tried to think of Hamilton in some regards as sort of, if I had to think of a modern version, maybe Ted Cruz, who's a constitutional scholar, obviously a very smart guy, but nobody likes Ted Cruz. Even his roommate said, I hate Ted Cruz, and that's the nicest thing anybody will ever say about him, but still a bright guy, right? So I think Hamilton along that way, I don't know if that's insulting, complimentary, well, take it either way you want to. So Hamilton's a visionary. Now there's some other people we should mention too. There's Roger Sherman from Connecticut. Sherman is the kind of guy that's able to get people to compromise. He looks for that middle ground and brings people together. Also there is John Dickinson. We remember him from Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer. He's back, still around. James Wilson, one of the nation's top attorneys out of Pennsylvania. He is an interesting guy. He's the one of the first Supreme Court justices, not the first. And he ends up in a strange way. He's the only Supreme Court judge, which is interesting today with the confirmation of a new Supreme Court justice, is that he's the only Supreme Court justice to ever go to jail. And he dies on the run from his creditors in the South, just how I want to go. So, but he's a brilliant lawyer. Also there is Elbridge Gerry. Actually, it's Elbridge Gerry to be precise. You know Elbridge Gerry. Well, one, he was known as Old Grumpletonian because, as according to John Adams once said, he opposed everything he didn't propose. So he's also the father of what we know as gerrymandering because he was the governor of Massachusetts when they drew a congressional district that looked like a salamander. How we got to Jerry with a soft G as opposed to Gary with a hard G, nobody knows. Now, the other person that's there is Maryland's Luther Martin. Now, Luther Martin is an interesting guy because he's a big states' rights guy. He wants more power to the states, but most of his speeches he's giving with a pretty good buzz, right? And that's not surprising. Most of these founders are going to be drinking heavily. And as you know, if you know anything about infectious diseases, that was one of the more safer drinks to drink, right? You didn't drink the water, for God's sakes. You didn't go over to the Delaware River and go, let me get a drink of water. And so hard cider, Madeira, rum. No, not Martin Luther. I knew the Lutheran thing was going to come up from Anthony. I was waiting for it. So yeah, they're on a pretty good buzz. There's actually a little book called The Alcoholic Republic about how much Americans used to drink. But he's a big states' rights advocate. Now, there are others there that we're not going to mention just now, but let's talk about those people that aren't there. That's important to know too. One, John Adams, he's not there. John Adams is a great ambassador to Great Britain, so he's not there, even though he wrote the Massachusetts Constitution, which is somewhat similar to the U.S. Constitution, and it's still the oldest constitution written constitution in existence. Then Thomas Jefferson, not there. Jefferson's the ambassador to France. Now, he's kept up to date by Madison, who sends him letters, but he's not there. And then there's at least three people that I want to mention that aren't there, and that is Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Patrick Henry. Now, these are three men that really got the American Revolution going, right? John Hancock helped finance it. Sam Adams helped organize it. And we know the fiery oratory of Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. They won't go. Patrick Henry says, I smell a rat. He says, you get all these men together. He's suspicious of it. And there's actually a book by Pauline Maier, the late Pauline Maier, called The Old Revolutionaries. And one of the arguments here is that you're looking here at this convention as a revolution, that these younger generation of Hamilton and Madison and others are saying, hey, older generation, Sam Adams, Patrick Henry, John Hancock, thanks for getting us our independence, but the form of government you gave us isn't working, and we're going to change it. And so really the convention is a revolution, but it's not a revolution fought with bullets, but it's going to be a revolution fought with words. And so they don't show up. Okay, so that's just some of the people that are there and not there. Now, let's talk about the first decisions they make. All right, first, they're going to make George Washington the president of the convention. And then the second thing they're going to decide to do is they're going to keep the meeting a secret. Now, why are they keeping the meeting a secret? Is it because they're involved in a conspiracy? Are they part of the Illuminati? No. What they figured is that if everything you said it did was printed back in your newspaper back home, then no one's going to say or do anything because they're fear of a political backlash. And so what they're saying is, they go, look, we're going to keep this a secret. And by the way, they actually did, unlike today, right? They actually did keep it a secret. And but if they kept it a secret, then everybody would be able to speak out their mind and say whatever they wanted to say. That's what they wanted to be able to do. Hey, say whatever you want. You're not going to be held politically responsible for it, but we want to have this flourishing of ideas here. Now, what we know about the convention comes from James Madison's diaries published after his death in 1841. He was quite the diarist, but we also know, again, this is a problem with historians, is that with modern technology, we can see that he had changed some parts of the diary after the event. So we don't, was it because he wanted to make somebody look bad, or is he trying to make somebody look better? So you got to take it with a little bit of grain of salt and analyze the diary very carefully. So they're going to keep the meeting a secret. Next thing they do is they say, look, we're going to scrap the articles. They're going to go. And that's because the states and people that wanted to scrap the articles showed up first and made that decision. They go, we're going to scrap the articles. They're just not working. We're going to have to come up with something new. And Madison had already had come up with a plan. And so he had asked another Virginian by the name of Randolph to introduce his plan, because if you're going to get rid of the old government, then you need a new form of government. And this will be known as the Virginia Plan. And we're going to just do a quick outline of the Virginia Plan. It called for a bicameral legislature, 2 houses, as opposed to what the articles had, a unicameral legislature, 1 house. You'd have a lower house elected by the people. Now, stop for a second. When we say the people, what they mean is that you had to be white male property owners. That's what they meant. They certainly weren't going to allow minorities to vote, and they certainly weren't going to allow women to vote. They thought that would have been a disaster. So there were this lower house, which Madison would call the House of Representatives, be elected by the people, and representation would be based on population. And then there would be an upper house, which we will call the Senate, and it would be also elected, or representation would be based on population, like the lower house, but it would be selected by the lower house. So there would be both houses would have representation based on population, the lower house elected by the people, the upper house selected by the lower house. So in other words, the states that had the largest population would get the most representation in both houses. Now, you can take a wild guess at which state was the most populous state at the time. If you said Virginia, you'd be absolutely right. So this certainly benefits Virginia. Now, it would also create an executive branch, we'll talk a little bit more about later, an independent judiciary, which did not exist under the Articles of Confederation, and would give the government more power to regulate trade, coin money, that sort of stuff. Now, the alternate plan was produced by William Patterson, New Jersey, and it's really closer to what they were supposed to do in the first place. It's really a revision of the Articles. It calls for a unicameral legislature, just like the Articles. Each state would get 1 vote, just like the Articles. But there would be some sort of executive that was being fleshed out. And the government would be given additional powers to regulate trade and try to cure some of the defects from the Articles of Confederation. So those are the 2 plans. Now the question is, which plan do they go with? Well, clearly they're going to go as their basic outline, the Virginia plan, because we have a bicameral legislature. But the question was, okay, wait a minute, we've got an issue of representation that we have to deal with here. If we do the way Madison wants to do it, then the large states are just going to swallow up the small states. And so what they think is, look, we're going to need some sort of compromise. They said, no, we need a great compromise, sometimes known as the Connecticut Compromise because of Roger Sherman. Now, the Great Compromise called on a lower house with representation based on population and elected by the people, white male property owners. They'd serve a 2-year term. The upper house would be called the Senate. And here we're going to say 2 per state. So that's going to give the small states an equal footing with the larger states. It's sort of like dividing that pie for them. Now, the Senate, and this is the way it's going to be up until the 1917, the 17th Amendment, the Senate will be selected by state legislatures. In fact, there are some people that want to abolish the 17th Amendment and going back to having state legislatures select your senators, Rick Perry being one. So first off, why state legislatures? Well, because the founders don't trust people, right? Madison had argued that the people were a great beast. Jefferson supposedly once remarked that the masses were well, masses without the M. And also, most of them believe in that old saying that if men were angels, you wouldn't need government. So I'm going to pause this for a second because my dog wants out. So there's a strong distrust of the populace, right? I think that if the founders came back today and saw what our democracy was and who's voting, they'd flip out. So those are the two versions here. They're splitting it by saying representation by population, lower house, elected by the people, upper house, everybody gets equal and selected by state legislatures. So why a 2-year term for the House and a 6-year term for the Senate? Well, they figured that the House would be a much more radical body, because think about it, you run for election, say in 2020, you serve in 2021, and you're running again in 2022. So the idea of the House is going to be a much more radical body. It's going to be much more connected to the public opinion. That's what you're going to be thinking about. And so you needed something to temper that. And the Senate would do that, because in the Senate, if you're John Cornyn, for example, right there, and you win election, or you're MJ Hagar and you win in 2020, you don't have to run again until 2026. And so the Senate's job was to be, and in fact, and back then you're being appointed by state legislatures, so you had 6 years. The Senate's job was to say, slow down, House, we're going to think this through. This was supposed to be the more thoughtful, deliberative body in the Senate. So that's why 2 and 6. But there's still another issue we have to discuss. If you're going to do representation by population, right, then the question is, you're going to have to do a census. And who do you count? You obviously count free people. But the question was, do you count slaves? Now, of course, the South says yes, because South Carolina, for example, was 60% slave. And the South feared that this new government would be dominated by Northerners, and unless they counted slaves, which made up a large portion of their population, they would be overwhelmed, and eventually this new government might just abolish slavery. So they want to count slaves for representation purposes. The Northern states say, you're got to be kidding me. You don't count slaves as people for any other purposes. You say they're property. We should not give you that kind of representation. You don't deserve that. Well, they're going to have to make a deal, or this is going to fall apart. And so they come up with what they call the Three-Fifths Compromise, where they say that a slave will count as 3/5 of a person. In fact, they don't even use the word slave because it sounded bad. Free peoples and all other peoples of bondage. That slaves would count as 3/5 of a person for representation and tax purposes. Plus, they added in there a fugitive slave clause that would require the government to seek fugitive slaves and help return them. And then also this Three-Fifths Compromise said that they would ban the importation of slaves after 1808. No more slaves in from other countries. Now, of course, historians estimate that between 1808 and 1860, probably 600,000 slaves were brought in the country illegally by people like Jim Bowie, Alamo hero, and person we named schools after him. Just makes you think about some of that occasionally in the whole historical context. So this Three-Fifths Compromise is going to give the South more power in the House than maybe it should have compared to Northern states. That's going to be important into this next section that we're going to talk about, and that's the executive branch. They know they need a chief executive. They know that was a defect of the Articles. They had to have something better, but they're cautious about this because they're afraid that if they give one person too much power, they could become a dictator. And they were very concerned about that because of that guy. He's sitting up there. People all know he's going to be the first president, and you don't want to call George Washington a dictator. In fact, somebody actually said, I'm not concerned about George Washington. I'm worried about the next guy, General Schlossington, as becoming a dictator. There is some talk of maybe using a plural executive where you'd have different parts of the executive branch elected, and thus weakening a president. It would be equivalent to what we do in Texas, where the governor's elected, but so's other members of the executive branch, the attorney general, the land commissioner. So the governor of Texas, in terms of constitutional power, is one of the least powerful positions in the country, interesting enough, constitutionally. But they decided on going on a single executive. Now, there was some talk of maybe just one 6-year term, which is something that people talk about today. Why not just have a president with a 6-year term and you can't run for re-election? But they decided on a single 4-year term. And of course, people get this confused. You could run as much as you wanted to. It's George Washington who, after 2 terms, says, you know what, I think 2 terms is enough for anybody and no one should run for more than that. And that becomes a custom that actually changes the meaning of the Constitution for about 150 years until Franklin Roosevelt says, yeah, I think I'm going to run for a 3rd term. But nobody else did, because they'd say, oh, Washington said you shouldn't run for more than 2. Why are you doing it, mister? Well, the last thing they wanted really was having the people select a president. They didn't trust the people. They thought you would, as I think George Mason said, that you would be duped by false patriots and people that could just mold public opinion and have very low character. They were always concerned about that. And so they don't really want a direct election of a president. So they come up with this idea of the Electoral College. Now, the Electoral College works this way, because we're coming up on an election. Each state gets electoral votes equal to the number of senators and representatives they have. So the more representatives you have, the more Electoral College votes you get. And then whoever would get, originally they said, the most Electoral College votes became president, and whoever got the second most became the vice president. Now, that's going to be a problem in Adams' administration and will be rectified by the 12th Amendment. But they're also thinking at the time, you really wouldn't have parties, that people would be able to come together and really decide this is a good person and we're going to go with that one. But they wanted to keep the people out of this. And this Electoral College would determine who really was going to be the president. So when you look at the Electoral College today, and it's always controversial, is that, and by the way, if Texas suddenly becomes a Democratic state, as opposed to being a Republican state, you might see those arguments about the Electoral College flip, and watch how quick parties will take the opposite side. But the Electoral College was designed really because they didn't trust you to elect people. They thought, like I said, you could easily be duped. And the other thing about the Electoral College is it gave a lot of power to the southern states, that thanks to the Three-Fifths Compromise. So I'm going to just do this poll here really quick, and you tell me real quickly, I misspelled a word here, meant to make south, where they're from. So you tell me, George Washington, is he north or south? Anybody going to vote here? North or south? Don't Google it. Anthony says south, which is, Lori says south. I even called up a poll for you to vote. But you're right. He is a Southerner. He's from Virginia. So how do I relaunch the poll? Okay, hang on. All right, so Washington's from the South. I don't know how to get to my next poll. So he's from the South. Now let go, since I can't figure this out, you can't see the poll. Why can't you see? Because I'm sharing a screen. That's why. No, I'm not sharing a screen. Why can't we see the poll? All right, well, I'm just going to do it since we only have 2. You can just put north or south. I'll see it pop up. I don't know what happened there. Okay, so Washington, Virginia. Okay, John Adams, north or south? Remember, Washington serves 8 years. Right, Anthony, north, right? Lori, north. He's from Massachusetts. All right, now next president, Jefferson, north or south? That's right, south. He's from Virginia, right? And by the way, Jefferson does not win the presidency over Adams in 1800, which was actually thrown to the House, if it's not for the Three-Fifths Compromise. So then we go to Madison, north or south. That's pretty easy, right? He is a South. He's a Virginian, right? He's a Virginian. He writes the Virginia Plan. Then we go to Monroe, north or south? Wild guess. Yes, wild guess. He is, again, from the South. He's a Virginian. So out of that first So far we're at 36 years. 36 years. The South is dominating the presidency. Then we go in 18, and remember, Monroe serves for 8 years. So these are all 8-year terms outside of Adams. Monroe serves for 8 years. And then in 1824, it's John Quincy Adams. And we have a very fascinating story about the election of 1824. John Quincy Adams is a Northerner. He's from Massachusetts like his father. But John Quincy Adams wins the presidency without getting the popular vote, nor getting the most Electoral College votes. Wow, that's interesting, right? So he is from the North. So far, the two Adams, which serve each a total of 8 years together, right? 4 for John and 4 for John Quincy Adams. Then we go to Andrew Jackson, born in South Carolina. He's a Southerner. He serves 8 years. Then we go to Martin Van Buren. Now, Van Buren is Jackson's right-hand man. He's from New York. He serves 4 years. So far, from 1790 to 1840, 12 years have been Northerners. Then in 1840, it's William Henry Harrison. He's a Southerner. He's also from Virginia. Virginia and Ohio have given us the most presidents. But as you know, William Henry Harrison serves for only 30 days and is succeeded by John Tyler, who is a Southerner and a man without a party because everybody hates him. Although one of Tyler's grandsons died just a couple of weeks ago, interestingly enough, he still has one grandson still alive. That's amazing, right? He died in 1862 and he still has a grandson still alive. So they're Southerners. Then it's James K. Polk. Now, Polk is from North Carolina, which is the South, right? Another Southerner. And then you have Zachary Taylor from Louisiana, also a Southerner, elected in 1848. He doesn't make it through his term either. But then you get to the Compromise of 1850, which throws out that whole same number of free states as slave states. We'll talk about that later. And then you get Franklin Pierce, who is a Northerner from Connecticut. James Buchanan, who's from Ohio, but only gets into power thanks to Southern states. And then Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln wins in 1860, even though he's not on the ballot in any Southern state. They would not allow him on the ballot. And so Southerners, realizing in the 1850s they'd lost control of the presidency, is another reason why they're going to go break off from the Union. So that tells you the importance of that 3/5 compromise on the selection of a president. Now, going back to the Electoral College, really what the founders expected, though, was they didn't expect the Electoral College really to pick the president. They thought the Electoral College would send up 3 or 4, maybe 5 qualified candidates. And of course, if no one gets the majority of Electoral College votes, it goes to the House of Representatives. And so the House would pick the president. And so they thought that's how they really like to see this work. So Electoral College, complicated, interesting stuff here as well. So let's get away from the presidency and let's talk about the judiciary. Now, there's only one court mentioned in the Constitution, and that's the Supreme Court. You can tell it's supreme because it comes with extra sour cream. I've learned that from eating at Taco Bell. Anything with extra sour cream becomes supreme. But it's the only court they mentioned. They said, we're going to leave it up to Congress to create the lower court system. We're not going to do that. And Congress will do that in 1789 with what they call the Judiciary Act of 1789. Now, what it tells us is that the Supreme Court is this is going to be the Supreme Court of the land. States didn't really think this would interfere with their decisions. They just thought it would be more of a federal jurisdiction, not interfering with state matters. They're going to be surprised by that. Well, justices on the Supreme Court, and we don't call them judges, right? We just got a new justice tonight, apparently. Senate voted on one. But justices were going to be appointed by the president with the consent of the Senate and serve a lifetime term. That's pretty amazing. But they wanted the judiciary to be as non-political as it could be. And I think you're seeing that struggle right now in the Supreme Court with the Chief Justice, John Roberts, trying to guide the court into neutrality as the parties try to pull it one way or the other. So the Supreme Court, when we look at it, and this is also new today, there's no definition of what the size of the court can be. It's been as few as 5. It's been as many as 10. That's up to Congress to create, because you hear about court packing plans, much like you did during FDR's administration. But the number has been fixed at 9 since the 1870s. But it's just a number. So it's, I guess, a number we've grown accustomed to. Who knows? Okay, so that's the Constitution in a nutshell. It's a brief version of the Constitutional Convention. They decide that once they've gotten this document done, that they're going to send it to the states for ratification. As soon as the states, or 9 of the states, ratify it, it will go into effect. And they know they've got to get the big states. That's Massachusetts, that's New York, that's Virginia. Those are the biggest states. They got to have those. Well, immediately, like you would guess, anytime you have any issue come up, there are going to be people for it and people against it. Now, people for it are going to be called the Federalists. And they're going to be led by people like Hamilton, Madison, and the New York attorney, John Jay, who will be the first Supreme Court justice, Chief Justice, rather. They published their articles in a series of papers called the Federalist Papers, which are still used today when making decisions. And their advantages are this. Their advantages is that George Washington supports the Constitution. Therefore, people of Washington. They have the money, so they can print more papers. And they tend to be the educated and better debaters. Now, on the other side, who couldn't really come up with a name, so they were just called the Anti-Federalists. You've got people like Sam Adams, who will eventually change his mind, Elbridge Gerry, who attended the convention, John Hancock, and Patrick Henry again. There's a lot of Anti-Federalists. And for the Anti-Federalists, if we had modern polling techniques as we do today, we probably find that most people were Anti-Federalist at the beginning, the larger percentage of the population. Okay, so let's just really quick talk about, and I'm simplifying this, you can take an entire graduate course, obviously, on ratification. What's the big issue with the Anti-Federalists? Well, there's a couple of things. One, they're saying, look, you weren't supposed to do this. You exceeded your mandate. You were there to revise the articles, not trash the articles. Okay. 2, you've made a strong central government. And this is what we just fought against in Great Britain. We just got rid of a strong central government. And now what you're proposing is something eerily similar to that. And we're distrustworthy of that. Especially you look at this Senate, a 6-year term. Who ever heard of a 6-year term? For example, in Massachusetts, everybody was elected every year. In fact, Massachusetts had a slogan where annual elections end, tyranny begins. So that's number 2. Number 3, and Patrick Henry and others had argued this, where's the Bill of Rights? You've listed the power of the government. Where's a listing of the rights of the people? In fact, in a bit of snarkiness, Patrick Henry said, why no Bill of Rights? And I'm quoting him here. Were you afraid you were going to waste too much paper? That's pretty snarky. So how do you answer this question? Well, number 1, the Federalists say, yeah, we exceeded our mandate. We had to, because obviously the articles weren't working. We had to try something new. So guilty as charged. 2, we didn't really make a strong central government. And Madison makes this argument. He said, we created 3 branches of government, each with a different mode of election, right? House elected by the people 2-year terms, Senate, state legislature 6-year terms, president 4-year term, Electoral College, Supreme Court, lifetime appointment by president with consent of the Senate. So each has a different mode of election. Each has a different term of office. And the idea behind the Constitution is that these 3 branches should always be struggling with each other. They should always be fighting with each other, because that limits any branch from getting too much power. Now, obviously, the founders thought that the legislative branch would be the dominant one. And again, they would be shocked by 20th century and 21st century presidents and the power they wield. But that's what they thought would happen. Madison said, we're going to create ambition to counteract ambition, that they should always be fighting each other. And so I think I mentioned this earlier. I was in Oklahoma City, and somebody had a sign, elect this person, they'll protect the president. And it was for a House seat. And I go, that's not your job. Your job is to fight on the behalf of the House. I remember John Cornyn ran. He says he wants to join the Bush team. I go, no, your job is to join the Senate team. It doesn't mean you can't support the president's policies, but you need to be supporting the Senate. That's what your job was to do. And that's what they were hoping would happen. Now, of course, things have changed. So that was their argument to that. And then finally, why no Bill of Rights? Well, Madison said, look, that's ridiculous. Why would you need a Bill of Rights? To protect you from who? The people you elected? And besides, he argued that states had their own Bill of Rights. So why would you have a federal Bill of Rights? That would seem to be redundant, really. Well, eventually they have to make deals. And one of the deals is that they will add a Bill of Rights. And the Constitution is very close to not being passed. In Pennsylvania, they were having a hard time getting a quorum. They had to send out the Sergeant of Arms to find Federalist legislators from the State House, drag them in and arrest them in the middle of the night and force them in their chairs so they could have a quorum and take a vote. And it passed the big states, Massachusetts by about 10 votes, New York only by 6 votes, and Virginia by about 2 votes. So that tells you how close this was. But it is ratified. And interestingly enough, they will add this Bill of Rights as they promised. And Madison is the author of this Bill of Rights. He works together about 17 amendments. That gets narrowed down to about 12. The first 2 dealt with, I believe, legislative districts, and the second one was congressional pay raises. The third one was the First Amendment, but the first 2 were dismissed. And so in 1791, we get the first 10 amendments, which we now know the Bill of Rights, because if you think about it, isn't it great to say, that's my First Amendment rights, instead of having to say that's my Third Amendment rights? And Madison becomes one of its biggest supporters, strangely enough. So when you look at the amending of the Constitution, especially in the United States, we did it 10 times in the first 2 years, and we've only done it 17 times since 1791. So it's not easy to amend the U.S. Constitution. The Texas Constitution, yes. Since 1876, we've amended the Texas Constitution over 450 times. So real quickly, I think I'll sum up with this and just going through this Bill of Rights very quickly. And we'll touch on some of the more important ones. Of course, we all know the First Amendment. It's got your freedom of speech. And keep this in mind. This Bill of Rights is essentially applying to the national government only. It's not applying to the states. Like in the First Amendment, it says Congress shall not pass laws that will abridge the freedom of speech. Congress, right? It's aiming at Congress. It doesn't say states can't do it. It's saying Congress. And it's not going to be really applied to the states until about 1925. The Bill of Rights didn't apply to state governments. And it's one reason why I always tell students, it's not the federal government that abuses your rights the most. It's historically been state governments that have done it. So that First Amendment deals with free speech. We know this. We know it's got the free press, freedom of assembly, and then it's got 2 parts on religion. One is the No Establishment Clause, which will not establish a state religion. Sorry, Lutherans. And the other one is that you won't prevent the free exercise of religion. Plus, you have the right to petition your government for redress. Now, obviously, there's going to be limits on all these, and we'll talk about them later. Now, the Second Amendment, people always think right to bear arms, but they don't read that whole amendment, which says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms should not be infringed. This becomes debatable because are we talking about having state militias? Is it talking about the right of the people to own, to keep and bear arms? Is that individuals or is that the people in general? Anybody who says they have a direct answer is not telling you the truth. The Third Amendment comes out of that Revolutionary War experience, right? That protects you against the quartering of troops in your home and peacetime, right? They can't do that. They can quarter troops in your home during a war, but not during peacetime. And that came from that British experience, the Quartering Act. The Fourth Amendment is another one of these that are really sort of iffy because the language is always sort of interesting. It's your protection against unreasonable search and seizure. What's unreasonable, right? That gets debated all the time. Again, that comes out of the Revolutionary War experience with writs of assistance the British would use to allow them to search without any cause whatsoever. The Fifth Amendment gets a little bit more complicated. There's a lot of parts to it that we don't want to go all the way into. Obviously, you know the part, you plead the Fifth, self-incrimination, but there's also a due process clause. You can not be deprived of life, liberty, or property without the due process of law. There's the double jeopardy clause, that you cannot be tried twice for the same crime, which, by the way, you can. You can be tried for a crime in federal court and be tried for the same crime in a state court and not be double jeopardy. And then the Fifth Amendment also has the power of eminent domain, which allows governments to seize private property for public use with just compensation. Now, the Sixth Amendment, that deals with your right to counsel. Now, this is a question I ask students all the time. I go, what if you can't afford an attorney? They go, well, one will be provided for you. Well, that's not in the Constitution. That's nowhere in the Constitution. And it's not even applied to the states in any type of case until the famous case of Powell versus Alabama in 1931, which is a fascinating case. And you can watch PBS miniseries on the Scottsboro Boys. It's a very interesting case, which was later made into a musical, which is bizarre to me. But it has that in there. It has your right to a trial. And people always say a jury of your peers. It's not a jury of your peers, because who would be my peers if I was on trial? Would we say you'd have to be mayors who are also political scientists, who are teachers, who are between the ages of 35 and 40? Let's just go with that. Shut up, everybody. It's just an impartial jury. And it has your right to confront witnesses and bring witnesses in your favor. The Seventh Amendment deals with the right of civil trial by jury in civil cases when the amount of controversy is over $20. Not interested in that. But the Eighth Amendment, we know, probably deals with my puns. It's your protection against cruel and unusual punishment. We don't whip people. We don't chop off their hands. We can still kill them. And it protects you against excessive bail. And that bail issue is a really interesting topic lately, because a lot of people are put in jail and can't afford bail. That's rhyming. And they're in jail for some time, far past the length of a sentence from that crime that they actually committed. And so there have been talk within both conservative and liberal circles of some sort of bail reform, and some Republican states and Democratic states have looked at doing it and have done so. The Eighth Amendment also, criminal and bail, got it. Ninth Amendment, here's one that's sort of interesting that a lot of people don't realize how important it is. Essentially, the Ninth Amendment says this. It says, look, the enumeration of certain rights doesn't mean that others may not be retained by the people. In other words, they've listed these rights in the Constitution. Could they have forgotten some of them? Yeah. And just because they haven't listed them there doesn't mean you don't have them, or you do have them. They just may have forgotten some. Sort of a catch-all. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because, you think today about the right to privacy. The word privacy doesn't show up in the Constitution. It's nowhere in there. But the right to privacy really comes out of this Ninth Amendment. And if you want to look up that case, that's Griswold versus Connecticut, 1962, I believe, somewhere in the 60s, where the Supreme Court comes up with what they call the penumbra theory, where if you take the First, Third, Fourth, Fifth, Ninth, and 14th Amendment, somewhere there's an implied right to privacy. Penumbra means the shadows of. In the shadows of those amendments is an implied right to privacy. Now, if you're an originalist, like our newest Supreme Court justice is, you would argue that there is no right to privacy, that if you want to add a right to privacy, amend the Constitution. But I would argue that you'd probably have a hard time doing that, because this idea of privacy is so ingrained in the American psyche, character, and tradition now that trying to change it would be difficult to do. And then finally, the last thing we're going to talk about tonight, and next week we'll start talking about Washington's presidency, is the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment is just really the basics of American federalism. It says whatever powers weren't given to the national government nor prohibited to the states are reserved to the states. Now, there are often those people, and I think I talked about this once before, you had people that called themselves truthers that believed that George Bush planned 9/11, which is crazy. They had birthers who believed that Obama's parents actually faked his birth certificate in 1961 so he could become the first African-American president. That's crazy. But then you have tenthers. Now, they're not crazy. What the tenthers believe is that more power needs to go back to the states under the 10th Amendment. The national government has assumed a lot more powers, mainly through the Commerce Clause, Interstate Commerce Clause, than probably the founders would not approved of. And so there are a lot of tenthers, Rick Perry being another one of these people who are tenthers, who'd like to see more power go back to states as not listed but to the federal government and reserved to the states. So there are those tenthers out there. So that's where we'll stop tonight. I hope that was a quick summary of the Constitutional Convention. Sorry about the Lutheran remarks. I think that's going to be something that's going on constantly. So we'll stop there and pick up Washington next time.